Jamie Silvanek lived on Randy Lane, a quiet street like so many others in Lehigh County. At just 14, she already had a complicated world behind her eyes. From the outside, she seemed like the kind of kid any parent would be proud of, bright, articulate, well-spoken. But there was another side to her. Teachers noticed it. Friends whispered about it. Her mother, Cheryl, tried to control it. And that's where everything started to fracture. Cheryl Silvanek was no monster. She was a concerned, sometimes overbearing, but ultimately caring mother trying to steer her daughter through adolescence. But Jamie didn't want steering. She wanted control. She resented rules, pushed back at boundaries, and found power in secrecy. And when the internet offered her a window into a bigger world, a world without curfews or parents or consequences, she stepped through without looking back. That's where she met him. Caleb Barnes. He was 20 years old, a private in the United States Army, stationed at Fort Meade in Maryland. Jamie told him she was 18, and for reasons only he truly knows, he believed her, or said he did. They struck up a relationship, first online, then in person. The distance between them didn't matter. Within weeks, they were wrapped in each other's lives, sharing fantasies, frustrations, and slowly, a sense of us against them. Jamie fed Caleb a narrative that her life at home was unbearable, that her mother was controlling and abusive, that she was a prisoner in her own house. Whether Caleb was manipulated or complicit is a question that would later haunt a courtroom. But in those early messages, it was clear he believed he was saving her. And Jamie was quick to reinforce that belief. Meanwhile, Cheryl was growing suspicious. She found messages. She noticed behavior. She knew something wasn't right, and when she finally confronted her daughter, the truth unraveled fast. Jamie was not 18. Caleb was an adult. And Cheryl, alarmed and furious, threatened to call the police. What she couldn't have known, what no parent could have imagined, was how deep this fantasy had sunk. Jamie didn't cry. She didn't retreat. She doubled down. And with chilling calm, she started talking to Caleb about what came next. There were messages, long, obsessive, dramatic. She hinted at running away. Then she hinted at something else. She told Caleb she wanted her mother gone. She said things would be easier without her. She asked if he would do it. And Caleb didn't walk away. In hindsight, the signs feel obvious. The escalation, the isolation, the obsession. But in real time, no one saw the whole picture. Not the teachers. Not the friends. Not even Cheryl, who was trying her best to keep her daughter close just as Jamie was slipping out of reach. That's the most unsettling part of this case. Before the murder, before the trial, before the headlines, it looked like just another teenage rebellion. Until it wasn't. Because beneath the ordinary, something monstrous was taking shape. And no one saw it coming. She was 14. But online, in texts and chats and whispered late-night phone calls, Jamie Silvanek became someone else. She became older, freer, braver. She crafted a version of herself designed not just to impress, but to manipulate. And Caleb Barnes, for reasons we may never fully understand, stepped into her world without hesitation. When he met Jamie, he thought she was 18. Or at least that's what he claimed later. But even without proof, the signs were there. Her face, her speech, her school uniform hidden just out of frame during video calls. Still, Caleb chose belief over reality. Maybe it was self-delusion. Maybe it was willful blindness. Or maybe, and this is the part no one likes to consider, maybe he didn't care. What is clear is that once they connected, it didn't take long for things to spiral. Caleb was stationed in Maryland, a few hours away, but the distance didn't matter. They found ways to meet. Sometimes Jamie would sneak away. Sometimes Caleb would drive up. The visits were secret, hurried, dangerous. That only made them more intoxicating. Jamie began to believe she was untouchable. She had a boyfriend, a soldier, someone who listened to her, believed her, treated her like an adult. For a teenager trying to break free of her mother's control, it was the ultimate rebellion. And she wasn't shy about pushing it further. Their texts became darker. I've seen the transcripts, hundreds of messages over weeks, a private world built one sentence at a time. Jamie would rant about her mother, about being treated like a child, about how things would be better if Cheryl were out of the picture. She used phrases like, "I wish she'd disappear," and "I just want peace." At first, it reads like teenage frustration, but then you see the shift. She asks Caleb if he'd protect her, if he'd do whatever it takes, and he replies that he would. She starts to test him. Would he hurt someone? Would he take care of it? She never uses the word murder. She doesn't have to. The meaning is crystal clear. What they were building wasn't just a romance. It was a shared delusion, fed by secrecy and adrenaline. Jamie framed her mother as the villain in their story, the only thing standing in the way of their future together. And Caleb, for all his training, for all his adult status, allowed himself to become her weapon. Cheryl, meanwhile, was trying to hold the line. She grounded Jamie, took her phone, confronted her about the relationship. She told Jamie it was over, that Caleb would be arrested if this continued. She thought fear would bring her daughter back. Instead, it pushed her further away. Because Jamie wasn't afraid. Not of her mother. Not of consequences. Not anymore. She had convinced herself, and maybe even Caleb, that what they had was bigger than the rules. That love justified anything. That once Cheryl was gone, everything would finally fall into place. And so, a fantasy became a plan. Quietly, gradually, step by step, the spark had already been lit. All it needed was a night, a ride home from a concert, and the right moment to ignite. On the night of March 14, 2015, Cheryl Sylvanek agreed to do something that would seem, to any outsider, like a favor. She drove her daughter and Caleb Barnes to a Breaking Benjamin concert in Scranton, a long trip, but not unusual for a parent trying to maintain some kind of peace. Despite everything, the lies, the tension, the threats, Cheryl still drove. Still waited. Still brought them home. That's what haunts me most about this part of the story. The ordinariness of it. The drive back took hours. It was dark. The kind of quiet, late-night highway where time stretches and thoughts settle. Cheryl was at the wheel. Jamie sat in the passenger seat. Caleb rode behind them, in the back. That positioning, it mattered. It wasn't random. They had discussed it beforehand. They were returning to Randy Lane. Home. According to court records, somewhere during that drive, the final decision was made. Maybe not spoken aloud, maybe just exchanged in a look, a nod, a flicker of readiness. But by the time they turned into the driveway, the plan was active. What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds, and yet it changed everything. Cheryl shifted the car into park. Jamie stepped out, and Caleb, from the back seat, lunged forward. He grabbed her from behind, pulled her down, and began to strangle her. There was no warning, no scream. It was a blitz, fast, brutal. But it wasn't enough. As Cheryl fought, Caleb reached for the knife he'd brought with him. And then he cut her throat. Multiple times. Jamie didn't intervene. She didn't run. She watched. That's what investigators later confirmed. She stood outside the vehicle as her mother was murdered inside of it, feet away. There was blood on the seats. Blood on Caleb. Blood on the knife. And silence. When it was done, Cheryl was dead, slumped in the driver's seat, lifeless. Her daughter didn't cry. She didn't call for help. Together, she and Caleb moved her body into the trunk. The next few hours were methodical. Cold. Not panicked, but purposeful. They drove Cheryl's car out to a wooded area nearby. There, they dug a shallow grave, barely deep enough to cover the body. It was hurried, uneven, a crude attempt to bury not just the evidence, but the act itself. Then, they turned to the vehicle. They wanted it gone, too. They drove it to a pond not far from the burial site and rolled it in. It didn't sink entirely, not at first, but they left it anyway, headlights vanishing beneath the waterline. And then, astonishingly, they went home. To Jamie's house. To her bedroom. Police would later say the two climbed into bed together. As if nothing had happened. As if this was just another night. They didn't run. They didn't hide. That's what stunned investigators. These weren't two people trying to escape. They were two people who believed, in some twisted way, that this was all behind them. But it wasn't. Not even close. Because just a few hours later, the questions began. Cheryl hadn't shown up. Her phone was off. Her car was missing. And someone had seen something. A neighbor. A camera. A flash of movement too strange to ignore. The police arrived that same morning. And what they found behind the closed door of Jamie Sylvanek's room would shatter any illusion that this was a crime of impulse or confusion. It was a crime of intent. And the reckoning was just beginning. By the time the sun came up on March 15th, Cheryl Sylvanek was already buried in a shallow grave near a remote patch of woods in Lehigh County. Her car, half submerged in a murky pond, sat like a monument to something left unfinished. But even as the water settled around the fenders, the cover-up was already starting to unravel. It didn't take long for someone to notice Cheryl was missing. A friend couldn't reach her. Her phone rang unanswered. She hadn't returned any messages since the previous night. And when calls to Jamie also went ignored, concern turned to fear. By mid-morning, police were knocking on the door of the Sylvanek home. Inside, they found Jamie in her bedroom. Caleb was with her. The two weren't panicked or evasive. They were calm. Too calm. The kind of stillness that doesn't sit right with trained eyes. Officers separated them and started asking questions. Where's Cheryl? When did you last see her? What happened after the concert? The answers didn't match. Jamie said her mother had dropped them off and left. She didn't know where she went. Caleb claimed he hadn't been in the car at all, that he and Jamie had walked home. But the stories kept shifting. Details changed. Time frames didn't line up. And then came the mistake. Caleb agreed to let police search his vehicle, a red Ford Explorer. In the trunk, officers found a large knife. Bloodstains. Clothing. Evidence that didn't just raise suspicion, it screamed guilt. Within hours, the crime scene was expanding. The pond was located. Cheryl's car was found, partially submerged. Inside, traces of blood, drag marks. Nearby, the disturbed soil. Shovels. Gloves. And finally, the body. Cheryl Sylvanek, mother, wife, nurse, 54 years old, was declared dead on the scene. The autopsy would later confirm what investigators already knew. She had been strangled, then stabbed multiple times in the neck. The arrest came quickly. Jamie and Caleb were both taken into custody that same day. They were read their rights, questioned separately, and that's when the real performances began. Caleb claimed he killed Cheryl to protect Jamie, that Cheryl had become violent, that she was threatening them, that Jamie had told him she was pregnant and afraid. He portrayed himself as a hero, not a killer, a soldier stepping in to save the girl he loved. Jamie, on the other hand, told a different story. She said Caleb had snapped, that he'd forced her to help, that she'd been raped, manipulated, terrified. She described him as controlling and dangerous, a man who used her youth and fear against her. But both stories had holes. Big ones. There was no evidence Jamie had been assaulted. No pregnancy. No bruises. No timeline to support coercion. In the digital trail, the texts, the chats, the planning told a colder, more calculated version of events. In those messages, Jamie wasn't a victim. She was a co-conspirator. She had encouraged the act, pushed it, fantasized about it, even helped arrange the logistics, down to where to hide the body and how to dispose of the car. Police saw through it quickly. This wasn't about protection. It wasn't about fear. It was about getting rid of an obstacle. A mother who said no. A threat to a fantasy. And now, that fantasy had become a courtroom case. One that would test not just the facts, but the very idea of what it means to be a child capable of murder. They walked into court as co-defendants. They left as enemies. Once Jamie and Caleb were arrested, the romantic delusion they had built together cracked almost instantly. In police custody, away from each other, their stories drifted further apart. By the time their legal teams were assembled, each was pointing the finger squarely at the other. Caleb's lawyers were first to act. They painted Jamie as the manipulator, a master of deception who had lied about her age, lied to police, and orchestrated the killing from day one. They brought the messages into evidence, Jamie saying things like, "Just do it," and "I want her gone." They described Caleb as a gullible young man, emotionally wrapped around the finger of a disturbed teenager. He was a soldier, they argued, not a murderer. A man who'd been led into darkness by a girl who knew exactly what she was doing. Jamie's attorneys fired back. They argued that she was a child, legally, emotionally, psychologically. That Caleb had groomed her, isolated her, and ultimately forced her into a corner. They claimed she had no real power in the situation, that she had been pulled into the plot by fear and manipulation. But both arguments had a fatal flaw. The digital evidence, the texts, the call logs, the planning showed cooperation, willingness, initiative. And over time, one thing became disturbingly clear. Jamie wasn't just going along with Caleb. She was often leading. In one message, she mapped out where to hide the body. In another, she told Caleb that her mother deserved it. She reassured him, coached him, encouraged him. This was not a girl dragged into a crime. This was someone participating and perhaps directing. As the trial for Caleb moved forward in August 2016, Jamie took the stand. It was her testimony that would seal his fate, but it also exposed the full rupture between them. Under oath, Jamie described in detail how Caleb had strangled and stabbed her mother. She said she was scared, shocked, frozen. But the prosecution had already shown the jury the messages, the planning. The emotional manipulation flowed both ways. When the defense cross-examined her, they challenged every word. If she was afraid, Why didn't she run? If she was a victim, why did she stay with him, even after the murder? Why did she help bury the body? Why, when given a chance to stop it all, did she say, "Just do it already"? She had no good answers. Only a blank stare and the words, "I don't know." And somewhere during those long, heavy days of testimony, the story changed in the public eye. Caleb was no longer the only villain. Jamie, just 14 when she helped plan her mother's murder, was no longer a passive figure. The prosecution made a bold argument. They said this crime wasn't just the product of one man's violence, it was a shared fantasy. And in that fantasy, Jamie Sylvanek wasn't a child. She was the architect. In the end, justice came not with dramatic confessions or tears in the courtroom, but with a quiet, deliberate finality. Caleb Barnes was convicted in August 2016 of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and multiple related charges. The jury rejected every argument about love, protection, or manipulation. They saw the truth in the evidence, in the knife wounds, in the buried body, in the text messages that showed cold intention long before the first blow. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 22 to 44 years. In court, he showed no remorse, no apology, no explanation, just silence. It was Jamie's turn next. At just 14, her legal team had tried to move her case to juvenile court. They argued her brain wasn't fully developed, that she had been influenced, pressured, and that she deserved a chance at rehabilitation. The judge disagreed. She was charged as an adult, not because of her age, but because of her actions. In February 2016, Jamie pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, criminal conspiracy, and evidence tampering. The court sentenced her to 35 years to life in prison. She would be eligible for parole someday, but not soon, and not easily. During sentencing, prosecutors described Jamie as calculating, composed, and emotionally detached. The girl who had stood beside her mother's corpse, not in shock, but in control. The court didn't see a frightened child. They saw a willing participant, and they sentenced her accordingly. Later, Jamie would file appeals claiming ineffective counsel, psychological trauma, coercion. She tried to argue that her age hadn't been fairly considered, that she hadn't fully understood what she was doing. But every appeal was denied. The judges reviewed the evidence, the transcripts, the planning. They reached the same conclusion every time. This was not a mistake of youth. It was a murder, and a deliberate one. There's no redemption arc here. No moment of public apology. No healing statement. Just silence. Jamie Sylvanek remains behind bars in a Pennsylvania state prison. She is no longer the youngest woman in the system, but she remains one of the most infamous. Caleb Barnes, too, will never leave the walls that now contain him. And Cheryl Sylvanek? She's buried in a quiet cemetery not far from the neighborhood where she raised her daughter. Her gravestone says little, but it marks the end of a life that was taken not by a stranger, but by someone she tried to protect. I've covered dozens of cases, some cold-blooded, others senseless, many tragic. But this one stays with me for one simple, brutal reason. The person who orchestrated it all was still in middle school. A lie about age became a weapon. A love story turned into a blueprint for murder. And a mother's final ride home ended with the one betrayal no parent ever expects. I'm Alex Carter, and this was the story of Jamie Sylvanek, the girl who helped kill the woman who gave her life.